Father George Bowen, you are the postulator of the cause of Saint John Henry Newman.
Yeah.
How did this idea arise?
Well, it started really at the very beginning of the process, I suppose, when he'd been made a saint at the canonization in 2019. There were people that were saying at that stage that John Henry Newman ought to be a doctor of the church, and I'd been involved in helping on the administration of that process out here in Rome, coming out here and working around the edges of everything that was going on. And people were coming up to me and saying, well, come on, Father George, you're doctor of the church. And so after, really at that stage, began to think, well, look, listen, we've got to start thinking about this, and how can we begin the process? And the dicastery that looks after this is the same one for the canonization. It's the dicastery for the causes of the saints. And so I went along initially, just at the very beginning of 2020, to talk to the dicastery about the process and to try and understand what the process was, so that we could begin thinking back initially in England where we would go and how this would work. And so that, I suppose, it began really straight after he'd been made a saint. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How many people participate in creating the Positio, this document where you gather all the information for the postulator?
It was, I would like to begin by saying a lot of people, beginning with the popes. The case that was being made for John Henry Newman to be a doctor of the church begins with the fact that so many popes down the ages have spoken about him, and so they are the ones that drive the thing, really, in a sense. It was the fact that so many popes down the ages had spoken about John Henry Newman as being a doctor of the church, and what we did then was to bring together a group of people to support what the popes had been saying about Newman, and so we engaged 20 academics from around the world who are experts in Newman to write different sections of what's called the Positio, the document which is the case that's being made for this process.
Mm-hmm. And that gathers his life, his writings. Can you tell us a little bit
about that?
So that
includes a biography, short biography of his life, a description of his writings, and then what the popes have said about that Newman as having eminent doctrine, because the case needs to be made, and I think this is the way to think about this. The doctor of the church is somebody that is saying something eminent. In the English language, eminent means something that stands out, something that rises above the normal, and his teaching needs to be something that stands out, both in terms of it being timeless, standing out because it appeals down the ages. It's not something that's going to get out of date. And universal, that's to say, it's not just something that's peculiar to the English-speaking world, but something that speaks to the whole world. So those are the two criteria that are looked for, the quality of timeless quality and the quality that it appeals and resonates universally. Those are the two characteristics which are needed in trying to think about Newman as doctor of the church. Yeah.
And when we speak about this universal appeal, gathering the church all over the world, you sent out letters to get this message through, or how did this process happen?
It began with the letters being sent out. What happened was that the actors for the cause, which were the Bishops' Conference of England and Wales, the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales, and the Birmingham Oratory, but the actors wrote letters to all the different bishops' conferences around the world, and saying, would you be prepared to suggest to the Holy Father that you'd support him if he would just decide to declare Newman as doctor of the church. So it's a decision that the Pope makes. It's entirely within the freedom of the Pope to declare whether somebody's a doctor of the church. And that process began by us writing to all the bishops' conferences around the world, using a little page with quotations from John Henry Newman, a page of quotations on John Henry Newman from popes down the ages, from Pope St. Pius X right the way through to Pope Francis, was the Pope that canonized Saint John Henry Newman. And the process began with his, at that stage, under his papacy. And the first thing is that to be a doctor of the church, it's a decision that the Pope makes. He's free to be able to decide whether he wants to make another doctor of the church, and there have been very few in the whole history of Christianity. There have only been 37 so far. Now we're going to have 38 doctors of the church. So it's not something that happens every day. It's not something that, it's very unusual in that respect. And one has to respect the fact that the Pope might well think, I don't want to make anybody, there's no reason to make anybody new a doctor of the church. But he has to be moved to decide that he wants to make, to call somebody a doctor of the church. And so that was the process began really with trying to pull together evidence of the fact that Newman's doctrine was eminent, that it spoke powerfully to the world in which we live, and that it had universal appeal.
Mm-hmm. And when you speak about universal appeal, I remember we saw some of those letters. Was there any letter from Latin America? Were you surprised to see this?
It was beautiful because we sent out letters we sent out letters to all the different bishops' conferences. Literally every bishop we had with a colleague and myself. We literally posted out letters to every single bishop's conference. And we got back these amazing letters from Latin America, from the language groups you'd expect from the countries like the United States, which has a huge following, a huge interest in John Henry. And I'd love to talk about that, about the importance of Newman and the American influence in this whole thing, especially to those of you in the United States that are listening. But yes, in Latin America, from Peru, from Ecuador, from Chile, there were lots of different countries that wrote in to give support. And then in the north, the Scandinavian countries, and then Eastern European countries, all over the world. So we got them. Yeah.
And when you speak about his doctrine being so important, not only for the church but for the rest of the world, what is this appeal that he has? Why is the whole world captivated with his writings in this sense?
So I think there are two aspects to this which are really important. The first is the fact that Newman speaks to the world at large, and says something important and timeless to the world that's out there at large, not just simply within the church. And these are going to be areas, especially the area that Pope Leo has decided to focus upon, which is the area of education. In the world in which we live at the moment, we see that young people, and not just young people, all of us, have attempted to try and get lost in trying to find out what's happening, and the influences that come upon us can be hugely distracting for us, and we lose a sense of what is true. And Newman was very keen to say, look, listen, truth is something that we need to discover, and we need to push our way past all the different issues that present themselves to us in this world as being true. We need to find what is really true. So it's the process of discovering truth. This is something that goes to the very heart of what Newman wanted to try and say to the world in all that he taught, in all of his writings, in all of his life. Really, it was about a journey of discovering the truth. He ended his life wanting as his epitaph, the phrase that you say that sums up everything. In Latin, I'll give it to you a quote in Latin. It goes ex umbris et imaginibus, from shadows and phantasms, in veritatem, towards or into truth. We need to go past all the things that present themselves as being true towards the real truth. And that's a challenge which is never more important than in the time in which we live now, when we need to struggle our way, find our way past stuff which presents itself to us being true, to find truth. So I think this is something that's particularly timely, particularly relevant, and resonating for us in the world in which we live today.
And in his journey finding truth, he had this conversion. Can you tell us a little bit about this conversion and what attracted him so much about the Catholic Church?
His journey of conversion began when he was a kid, and he'd had all sorts of difficulties in his life. His father had run out of money, had to leave. They'd been living in London at the time, and he'd had to leave. The father had to leave London with his family. Rather scary, really. And he'd said in the school holidays, he'd said to the teacher, one of the teachers in the school when Newman was learning, look, listen, can you look after my son while we all go away, while I try and find a house and a place to live in? And so they left Newman with this man who had a huge influence on him in bringing him to discover Christ. He was a Calvinist, he was an evangelical Christian, but he taught Newman about Christ, really. For the first time, although Newman had been brought up by a family that were nominally Christian, that nevertheless, it was really through this contact with another human being that opened up Christ to him, that he began to realize that this was not all about the intellect, about what you learn in a school on a school desk. It's not necessarily what you sit in the back of a church and hear, but that it's stuff that needs to touch your heart. So his heart was first moved. His journey of faith began when he was under the influence of an evangelical teacher in the Church of England. And that journey developed and grew as he went to university, to Oxford University, and then it led to him becoming a member of the Church of England, a member of the clergy of the Church of England. And so it was as a clergyman in the Church of England that he began to realize, from a point of view of preaching the gospel of Christ, before he really was able to start teaching in Oxford, his first experience was of trying to unpack Christ, unpack the gospel of Christ to ordinary people. And the experience had a massive effect on him. It changed the way he realized that it wasn't the process of discovering Christ wasn't something that you could sit down and find in books only by just opening the Bible and reading, because people that can't read, how are they going to find Christ? How are the words going to leap off the page? And so Newman discovered that this was something really important. So he became hugely affected by the need to try and open up Christ to other people. And in his own way, as a very young man, as a very young member of the clergy of the Church of England, he learnt this. And he took that first lesson he really learnt was from trying to talk about Christ to ordinary people. He took that lesson and let that lesson become something that influenced the way he taught in university. So in university, he was being expected to open the books and to talk from high position down to his students. And the first thing he did was to open up Christ and open up the influence that Christ had had upon him in the minds and the hearts of his students. And he became enormously popular, frighteningly popular for the for the professors and staff and the administration of the University of Oxford, who were very concerned about this person that was having such an immense influence, because he was listening to young people, he was letting them influence him, just in the same way that when we talk about Christ, we need to realize that it's a give and take. Bringing people to Christ is also about letting Christ come speak to us through other people, because we're all made in Christ's image, in the image of Christ. And so we need to be hugely respectful of the fact that other people, although they may not in themselves seem to know much about Christ, nevertheless they can tell us a lot about Christ. So I think that was the spirit that infused Saint John Henry Newman in the way that he taught about the faith. And that became something that was central to the way that that everything that he wrote about. And then his journey towards the Catholic Church began by him saying, I need to go back. In order to try and make sense of who I am as a member of the Church of England, I need to first of all understand, where does it all come from? And going back to Christ, and that was the second part of your question, going back to Christ in the Gospels, in the Scriptures, sacred Scriptures, and then seeing how Christ was unpacked, how Christ was explained, how the doctrine that was cradled, if you like, in the sacred Scriptures, was then opened up and explained to the world at large from the early fathers of the Church onwards. And that journey backwards, as a historian, led St. John Henry Newman forwards into the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm. And that aspect you mentioned, that is beautiful, because it's something we can see in his motto, Cora cor loquitur, the heart speaks to the heart. Yes. What does this have to say to Catholics today?
I think the first thing it says is, look, listen, Christ speaks to us through each other as well as through the gospel. Christ speaks to us through the church, but Christ speaks to us in each other. We need, if you like, and I think Newman would, in putting it in modern terms, Newman would want each one of us to think of the person that we're talking to as an immortal human being made in God's image. I mean, that was what animated his whole life in that way, looking for the presence of Christ beyond the way that people present themselves that they might present themselves to us in two dimensions. In the world in which we live now, so we're so encouraged to spend our time creating images of ourselves and presenting ourselves on screens to each other. And Newman would have thought, this is just this isn't the immortal. This isn't what makes us beautiful in God's image. What's beautiful in God's image isn't the screen the image that we project to each other on the screen. It's the real person, and to listen to the real person and talk to the real. So Newman resonates to us today in that way, as he does in so many others. Yeah.
And Pope Leo declaring him a co-patron of Catholic education, and also creating him a doctor of the church. What is the significance of this moment, something we're going to see this weekend? What is the significance of this?
Pope Leo points us towards the field of education as being hugely important for our young people, but for all of us. And we need to understand what that means. That word means, it means being led. The word education comes from the idea of being led away from. And if you like, coming back to the epitaph of John Henry Newman, being led away from all the images and phantasms, all the things that present to us as being true, towards the real truth. And that process is not something that is just about reading books. It's not just about opening screens and learning what other people are saying. It's encountering Christ's and the message of Christ in each other, and allowing us to be influenced by each other and to influence each other. And I think that's something that's essential to, and I'm sure that's one of the reasons why Pope Leo makes him a patron of education, as somebody that's because education is such a hugely important field, a field for us to be exploring and developing as we think about challenging all the challenges which present to us in the world today. We'll hear more about this, no doubt, from Pope Leo before too long, but I would have said that would be something that I think is especially beautiful and important.
Father George Bowen, I know that the figure of Henry Newman has been present in your life since a very young age.
Yeah, I came across Newman. Actually, it's interesting, you see, because I first came across Newman not through reading a great big dense book or anything like that. I came through listening to a piece of music. My grandfather was a member of the Church of England, and when I was a little kid, I think I must have been about 8, 9, 10, that sort of age, no older than that, he sat me down one day, and he had a record, a vinyl disc of a great piece of choral music called The Dream of Gerontius, which was Newman's poem set to music by a great English composer called Edward Elgar. And he said, "Listen, grandson, I want you to listen to this. It makes me cry." And I sat down with him and I listened to the music, and it moved me, and it moved me to tears. And it moved me to tears not just because the music was beautiful, but because of the words. I had a copy of the words that I was reading. I was able to read the words. And it struck me that it's this extraordinary story of a journey of a soul that goes from this world and makes a statement of faith. Firmly, I believe, and truly God is three, and makes a statement of faith on his deathbed, and then leaves this world and goes forward with all the prayers of the church surrounding his deathbed, all of his friends, all of his family, the priest who's sending his soul out into the hands of and then these angels that surround him as they lift him up, and as something precious, lifting him up as a precious, precious object towards God. As a little child, I mean, those words really struck me. And I think actually my priestly vocation probably started then. With looking back on it, that was the first time I was moved to tears, which was really the words of the church at the deathbed of a soul put into words by Saint John Henry Newman. Later, as I grew much older, as I was at university, I was lucky enough to be taught by my tutor, was an expert in John Henry Newman, and he got me to read, when I was at university, The Idea of the University. You know, what am I here for? What's this place? And what am I here for? And what it's all about? And I was again very struck by this lovely idea that Newman has about the whole human being, the whole person. The education is educating the whole person, not just simply the intellect, but that we should be educating producing moral human beings, people that have an understanding what the virtues, and that the virtues, And that education is about having a moral education as well as an intellectual education. And that's something that universities ought to teach. And they don't because most universities think of themselves as really basically being judged upon whether they've educated the intellect well enough, if you think about it. But this aspect of education, the moral aspect of education, is central and foundational to the way that Newman saw education. And that speaks very strongly to the world in which we live today. And I'm sure that would have been something that really influenced Pope Leo in deciding to name him co-patron of education for us all.
Father George Bowen, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And thanks for your work as a postulator.
My pleasure.